Hello and welcome to Leveraging Behavioral Strategies for Building Decarbonization. I am Dominic Libertor with CPI. Before I hand it off, I just wanted to do a few things for those of us that just joined us. First off, what is NARUC? NARUC is the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. It is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1889. Our members are the state regulatory commissioners in all 50 states and territories. FERC and FCC commissioners are also members, and NARUC has associate members in over 20 countries. NARUC members regulate electricity, natural gas, telecommunications, and water utilities. And then what does our department do? What is the Center for Partnerships and Innovation? We are a grant-funded team dedicated to providing technical assistance to our members. CPI identifies emerging challenges and connects state commissions with expertise and strategies. We build relationships, develop resources, and deliver training. Please check out our website at www.naruc.org/CPI-1 for more information. I will now hand it off to President Fiordaliso of the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities. Mr. President, please take it away.
Thank you, Dominic. And on behalf of the panelists and myself, I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar. We have an all-star panel. We can't say the same about the moderator, but the panelists are top-notch. And they are going to, I think, expand and share their knowledge with all of us as we go along. Behavioral changes are so necessary when we're dealing with energy efficiency, when we're dealing with green energy in general. It's such an important aspect to get people to think about different ways of using and generating energy. And there are so many states in the United States today that are engaged in green economies and expanding with every single day. You know, it's an unusual phenomenon. Generally, there are edicts that come from the federal government on down to the states. Well, it's been the states that have been the innovators insofar as green energy is concerned. It's the states that have promoted various forms of energy generation. And we have an obligation, everyone listening to us, have an obligation to talk to people, talk to our neighbors, talk to our families about how not only can we save energy, but how decarbonizing our environment is vital to the existence of our planet. Climate change is real. It's not something that's abstract here. It's not something that might come along. All we have to do is look at what's going on in California today. And there have been smoke and fog all across the country from those fires. All we have to do is look at the severe weather that each and every region of our country has experienced, more severe than usual. All we have to do is look at a place like Greenland, which is not all ice anymore. All we have to listen to is the scientists who say by the year 2100, if we do nothing, sea level rise will increase by 6 feet. Lower Manhattan would flood in a regular rainstorm. Regular rainstorm, I'm not talking a hurricane. Miami would be underwater. So we're not dealing with something that is abstract, and we're not dealing with something that is remote. And what we have to do, I believe, is to educate our fellow citizens on the dangers of climate change. Not necessarily for us, but future generations. We owe it to them. And then I would submit we have a moral obligation to them to mitigate the effects of climate change. But we have to start changing our behavior. We have to start doing the little things. Shut off the light. Get an energy-saving light bulb. Does it make a difference? You bet it does. You're charging your electronics. It's fully charged. Do you leave the plug in the outlet? Still drawing energy. So there are little things that each and every one of us can do. And it's incumbent upon us to do it, to mitigate the effects of climate change. As I said, we have an all-star panel, and I'm just going to give a brief introduction, and then I'll go over some of the ground rules for today's webinar. First on tap is Paul Hibbard. Paul is a principal at Analytics Group, a Boston-based economic and financial consulting firm. Paul is a former chairman of the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities. Welcome, Paul. We also have Mary Sprayregen, Director of Regulatory Affairs and Market Development for Oracle Utilities. Mary joined Oracle Utilities, formerly O-Power, in March of 2019 as its Director of Regulatory Affairs and Market Development. O-Power's behavioral energy efficiency programs have been adopted in more than 30 United States states. And then we have Kristin Munsch, Director of Regulatory and Customer Strategy for National Grid. Kristin is the director, as I said, with National Grid, and in her current role, Kristin and her team focus on regulatory policies advancing state and company clean energy goals. I want to welcome all of you, and I know I'm not the only one who's anxious to hear what you have to say, because it's only how the experts can tell us. And I think what we've learned over the past 6 months with this pandemic, why don't we listen to the experts? So Paul, can we start with you after I go over the ground rules? After the presentation and panelist remarks, we will have time for questions from the audience. You may use the question and answer feature or use the raise hand button to ask a question during this time. The slide deck from Paul's presentation will be distributed, from my understanding, Paul, to attendees following the webinar. So with that, Paul, you're on stage. You have to unmute, Paul. No, we're not hearing you. I'm sorry.
There we go.
Okay,
that wasn't my fault. Thank you, President Fiordaliso. That was an excellent introduction. I think part of the way through it, I felt like going and crawling into my bed. I love the way you ended with, we need to do something about this, and I couldn't agree more. Such a great introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm so happy that I got the invite, in particular, to talk about this issue. As President Fiordaliso mentioned, I'm a former chair of the Mass DPU. I spent about an additional 10 years in state government, 7 years on staff at the DPU. So long ago, I'm not going to tell you when. And then years with the Massachusetts DEP, working on climate policy. And I was there at the DPU when we were at one point in time doing integrated resource management and valuing energy efficiency and looking at traditional metrics for how to integrate energy efficiency as part of a company's resource plan. And by the time I left, we had fully deregulated the industry, the utilities owned power plants, and we had gone through the process of forming ISO New England. So went through a huge amount of change in that and learned a lot. One thing that strikes me, though, is that not a lot has changed since back with respect to the evaluation of energy efficiency. A lot has changed data-wise. A lot has changed in terms of incorporating more and better information. But the rubric for evaluating efficiency has stayed largely the same, and that makes sense in the context of utility regulation. But since I left the state, I've been consulting, and one thing when I was thinking about this talk last night, one thing that really struck me is I've been consulting now since about 2000 since the year 2000 with a chunk of time when I went back to the DPU, but and have done a huge array of projects in electricity markets, regulation, everything. But what's really struck me is in the past 1 to 2 years, the number of calls that we get to do projects, analytic projects, strategic projects, policy projects that are related to greenhouse gases and how they're interacting with the system and with our energy systems is just phenomenal. Really, in the past year, I've been asked to do projects that are focused on greenhouse gases and climate change, but are looking at power system reliability, shareholder value, the impacts on vertically integrated utilities with both gas and electric operations, and how to plan out some sort of transition over the next couple of decades. The impact of electrification of the building and transportation sectors on power systems and on the obligations of utilities and the need for infrastructure to manage that, and how carbon pricing fits into all of these things. It's just an incredibly wide array of projects by not just by foundations or stakeholders, but we've been doing work for integrated utilities, for LDCs, for pipeline companies, for just an incredible range of companies that are trying to deal with what's going on right now, both from the standpoint of how climate change may affect operations, but also from the standpoint of how the states that are reacting to this are requirements that are really aggressive and are going to require a lot of work on behalf of the companies over the next couple of decades. So that's really struck me in the past couple of years. And the other thing that really struck me is in every single one of these engagements, what leads off the page is energy efficiency. We're doing analyses that are in some cases not necessarily related to electric utility resource planning or anything like that. But when you consider the issues related to climate change that the president laid out so graphically, and you consider the fact that states have really engaged on this and begun to implement important pieces of legislation and regulation, efficiency just kind of leaps off the page in every single one of these contexts. And so if you can go to the next slide there, the context for efficiency investments in some way, and I'll talk a little bit about this, is changing, I think, and should change. And in this changing context, and from a core focus on utility costs and ratepayer benefits, that's obviously not going to go away. But the level of importance on that relative to focusing on the value of efficiency as a greenhouse emission reduction tool, I think really needs to shift significantly, and I think it will in the coming years. And so in this context, I think there are some really important questions that we should be asking, including, are we really doing enough efficiency when you think about it in a different way? Are we properly valuing the climate benefits associated with efficiency and the emission reductions that come from them? And when we look at a more narrow viewpoint into benefit cost analysis that happens a lot in the context of utility programs, is that somehow constraining or narrowing the pipeline for efficiency investments that would make sense if we focused on it as a greenhouse gas mitigation tool? So we did, with this in hand, I worked with Mary and her team at Oracle on a piece of analysis that tried to focus on this and think about, ultimately, if you consider this from a different perspective, what would be the important metrics to consider in evaluating the design and funding for energy efficiency and the metrics that you would apply in the monitoring and evaluation of those programs. So we focused on those metrics. We looked at the time value of greenhouse gases and greenhouse gas emission reductions, and thought about this concept of what's the net present value of damages avoided due to energy efficiency based upon the social cost of carbon, and thought about are there ways that this ultimately affects the relative importance of certain efficiency program features. And to do this, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, to do this, we tried to find utility programs that we could pull apart and that were really fundamentally different. And they're broken into, in this presentation, structural programs and behavioral programs. So the behavioral programs are the ones that I think you're all familiar with, home energy reports and the like, that are focused on changing people's behavior. For the structural programs, there's obviously a lot of difference across states and a lot of difference even within states across utilities and across programs about what measures are included. So what we tried to do is we looked across a handful of states and created these structural programs that tend to involve some sort of an evaluation of potential savings, but also incentives for major structural investments, building shell, HVAC, appliances, things like that. So we tried to create these programs that we knew were very different in terms of their profiles, and then try to evaluate them from this greenhouse gas perspective and from the perspective of climate change damages to see if something comes out that's of use. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more on the changing context. The one that we're all familiar with, and that was in place in the early 90s or late 80s, whenever I started working at the DPU, are the focus on the savings to the utility, the savings in reduced generation, transmission, and distribution costs, and the ability to actually reduce bills for utility customers. Emission reductions have always been part of the assessment, but in most cases, not all, some states are actually really aggressive with their assessment of the emission reduction benefits, but really it's a relatively minor number of them. Otherwise, it's been always recognized, but not necessarily really focused on as the primary point. And so the real focus of utility investment and efficiency to this point has been investing some amount of money, not more than the point of where there are positive utility and ratepayer returns. And what this emerging context does, I think, is just ask the question, should we be focusing a little bit more on something else? We have, particularly in the past, I'd say 5 years, some incredibly aggressive greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements that are mandated under state law now and state policy, and that tend to involve really fast timelines for achieving steep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, this is happening in reaction with appropriate state reaction to what the science is telling us about the urgent need for making progress for reducing emissions as soon as possible and as much as possible, with the idea that we're holding on to a fish and it's starting to slip out of our hands, that we are we're running into an increasing risk that we'll fail to rein in climate change and potentially pass some dangerous tipping points, some dangerous thresholds. And I think it was just last week, I think I was reading something, again, even just more depressing about the loosening of some of the ice shelves, I believe in Antarctica, that weren't expected to actually loosen quite this much for some time. And these are the sort of things that I think keep climate scientists up at night and should keep more of us up at night, because they could lead to fairly rapid and catastrophic changes, not just in our environment, but in our societies and our economies. So this is, when I consider all these things, I know that there's often talk about, well, the states are passing aggressive greenhouse gas laws, but once we figure out how challenging it might be, there could be some retrenchment. I would say now, and I've been asked this by a lot of clients recently, that I would not expect any retrenchment in the number of states passing aggressive laws to reduce greenhouse gases or the laws that are in place in individual states. everything to me points to things becoming more aggressive and more stringent over time. So within this context, and I apologize for going on a bit about it, but this is where I really think that there's the way in which we look at energy efficiency is really not putting the proper emphasis on the greenhouse gas emission reduction potential of efficiency, where in that case, you wouldn't just invest up to the point of positive consumer returns or utility returns. You'd invest to the point where the net carbon abatement cost of the energy efficiency measure is less than the next option for reducing carbon, not just within the electric sector, but across economies that need to, all the energy sectors in the economy. Next slide, please. So in this context, timing really matters. The greenhouse gas standards that are being developed and have really quickly come on the books recently are very aggressive. It will not be easier to achieve them over the next couple of decades, not without some startling technological breakthrough we're not quite aware of yet. In most cases, the states are faced with the mandates of making these reductions, but they don't quite know exactly how it's going to happen yet. And ultimately, you know, as mentioned on the last slide, we're beginning to run out of time, both from the climate perspective and from the policy perspective. And so it's in this context where efficiency stands out. It's not just the lowest cost way to achieve carbon reduction, a low cost. It's often by far the lowest cost way to achieve reductions. And I don't just mean cost-effective energy efficiency. I mean energy efficiency with benefit cost ratios less than 1. Still, you can go way up that supply curve and not get to the next lower cost carbon abatement option. It's also, I think, an important piece of context is that it has been key to implementing carbon pricing programs in a way that can mitigate or turn around the potential economic impacts. Certainly in the RGGI states in the Northeast, the reinvestment of allowance proceeds in energy efficiency has generated positive economic impacts, growth and value added for the states, economic value added, and growth in jobs. So it can have that impact if designed correctly. But the second piece of this that I wonder about is that electrification is viewed really widely right now as potentially playing a major role in the states meeting their economy-wide decarbonization targets. And in this context, the world of electricity demand could get very strange to the extent this happens relatively quickly, rapidly increasing load, but also changing the shape of load. And we all know how effective efficiency and demand response and price responsive demand could be in helping ease that transition and make it easier to maintain power system reliability. So the question we're really asking is, when looked at from this perspective, are there differences between energy efficiency programs? And next slide, please. So as I mentioned, what we tried to do is create these two categories of efficiency programs, and I want to reiterate that, you know, having for a number of different projects had to delve into the details of efficiency program design, efficiency cost effectiveness assessments, monitoring and verification of programs. It is a world you don't want to get into if you're not in it already. It's there's way too much information. Very little of it is consistent. A lot of it's consistent, but not enough to satisfy a consultant or an analyst. So it's just a challenging world to deal with. So what we tried to do is say, let's pick a group of states that are really aggressive with efficiency and that have some comprehensive programs involving assessment of homes and combining that with major structural features, and pick from them those types of structural programs. And that's what we call structural efficiency. And then the other one are the behavioral programs. And so my assumption walking into this was structural programs must be better from a climate perspective. You get much deeper savings on a per customer basis. Most of the measures, if not all of the measures, are longer lived than the expected savings that accrue from implementing behavioral programs. And ultimately what we found is, well, it's not necessarily true. The behavioral programs can achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions right away, fast, with very little administrative effort. And that has value in the climate change context, getting reductions sooner rather than later. The savings per customer are obviously shorter, but you can engage many more customers on an annual basis. The programs are repeatable. and they can be used to actually target greenhouse gas emission reductions in other ways, other sectors, but also within the context of existing programs. And so, we did this analysis, and I'll just talk a little bit about these charts on the right. What we try to capture on the vertical axis of the top chart is the avoided climate damages. So you implement an efficiency program. Let's say you install HVAC that you otherwise wouldn't have. It reduces consumption of energy and reduces greenhouse gas emissions for a very long time. In each year, it reduces those emissions. It has a specific value that's accounted for in the social cost of carbon for that year. Now, the question we asked is, if you looked at the cumulative present value of the damages avoided, consistent with the social cost of carbon, how does that compare over time? And so in the top chart, the vertical axis is the avoided damages due to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, climate damages only in 2020 dollars in millions. And then what we have on the horizontal axis is time, obviously, but the green line is the implementation of a single program cycle of structural programs, and the blue line is a single program cycle of behavioral programs. But the question we were trying to ask with this piece of analysis is, if you just continued the behavioral programs year after year, how long would it take you to achieve the same level of avoided climate damages on a net present value basis as the structural programs? And you can see here that you achieve them really very quickly. And this takes into account both the savings in just being able to reach so many customers, but also the time value of those avoided damages from climate change. And so that's the kind of the first thing that leapt out. And the other one is we looked at the cost to achieve these avoided damages between the two programs. And the bottom chart is really just showing that for a few of the sets of programs, that the behavioral programs are just able to achieve avoided climate change damages at a lower cost than the structural programs for a wide variety of reasons. This chart, I just want to caution you in looking at it. The purpose of doing this was really to compare this metric of cost to achieve reduced damages and compare them between the structural and behavioral programs. When you consider what is the actual cost of abatement here, it's not positive, it's negative. What's not included in here so that we could compare this direct cost metric are the benefits of these programs. These programs are all cost beneficial. They're all generating more benefits than they cost. So the actual cost of achieving avoided damages here is negative. And that's true for all of the efficiency programs that the utilities administer. But ultimately, we just wanted to show on a relative basis the direct cost and how they factor into avoiding damages. So the analysis really just shows that the obvious is that all efficiency programs are exceptional and needed from a climate change and climate policy perspective. But the behavioral programs can actually provide a lot of value sooner, and when looked at from a climate perspective, it's a piece of the puzzle that I think is currently missing, that there's a lot of benefit there from this perspective that really doesn't emerge when you think about the features and the metrics of behavioral versus structural programs. Next slide, please. Just a couple of other points of data here. One of the obvious reasons that this is an outcome is in this top chart. It's just showing the number of participants. The behavioral programs can reach as many participants as the utilities want them to in a given year, up to the number of customers, of course. And the structural programs are just a little bit more challenging to roll out. And so that's one of the reasons that you get this additional value that takes into account the time value of avoided climate damages. And the other piece of this is that, we looked into Uplift and the ability of behavioral programs to be tailored in a way to increase participation in other efficiency programs, so that there's this additional benefit that derived not only from the behavioral programs, but from the additional savings that come from greater participation in the structural programs. And so the bottom chart is just showing what that magnitude of additional benefit is, with the red line being an assumption based upon some of the results we've looked at, though I admit there's not a whole lot of data on this. The assumption that the behavioral programs increase the structural program participation by 10%, and the yellow line on top is increasing it by 30, and that's within the range of some of the results that we saw. But ultimately, those are results that did not focus on the ability of behavioral programs to increase, to provide this uplift benefit. And that's something that ultimately the ease of customer contact and the way to administer the behavioral programs and tailor the messages is something that's, I think, still sitting on the table. And there's a lot more that could be done with respect to that, and the potential climate benefits flow from that as well. Next slide, please. So ultimately in our paper, we went through this for a range of programs at utilities. The recommendations that we identify, some of them are sort of no-brainers, and I doubt there's anyone on this call that doesn't understand them. But obviously pursue all cost-effective energy efficiency, because any cost-effective energy efficiency is a cheaper way to achieve carbon reductions and greenhouse gas reductions than any other way possible. But then again, to think about how can we go beyond that and actually implement more energy efficiency than might be strictly cost-effective from the utility or the utility plus ratepayer perspective, but is very cost-effective from a state perspective, a state policy perspective, that in a state that needs to achieve aggressive reductions. It makes sense in this context, I think, to recognize the time value of greenhouse gas reductions that can help guide this sort of assessment from both the avoided damages perspective and then more qualitatively from the perspective of, as a state, we need to achieve massive reductions in greenhouse gases. How are we going to do it? And there's a time value in doing that as soon as possible and as much as possible. And that's where I think these types of programs come in with significant benefits. The next one is integrating, and one way to think about it would be to integrate greenhouse gas focused metrics more in evaluating the design and budgeting and performance of utility EE programs, including the ability to achieve reductions excuse me, in greenhouse gas emissions sooner rather than later, and what the present value of those of the reductions in climate change damages is associated with those emission reductions. It makes sense, I think, because this is where some of that message gets lost, to maintain and to focus still on annual energy savings targets, even where states are shifting to a view more to the lifetime energy savings targets. Because of this time value issue and because of the avoided damages merits of programs that have very short or that have very short measure lives, so energy annual savings targets are more important than lifetime. I think it's important to maintain both and consider it all within this context. Obviously, design performance incentives that simultaneously maximize the cost effectiveness savings, but also thinking about the greenhouse gas benefits. And as I mentioned on the last slide, think more creatively about and promote much more aggressive joint design and administration of behavioral and other energy efficiency programs, and do it within the context of what is the state's policy and what are the energy policy and climate policy in addition to utility and ratepayer policy. And how do we think about that, and what can we do with behavioral programs that can help the state move forward with its climate goals, in addition to help achieve utility cost reductions and consumer ratepayer benefits. So I think I'm going a little over. I'll wrap this up really quickly. Next slide. So the context efficiency is changing, and it really has to change. Reflecting back on the president's remarks earlier, I just think this sense of urgency is palpable now, and it's growing, and it's not likely to abate. And so when we think about efficiency, if we get stuck within the utility box, we're really losing an opportunity and to some extent missing the point. And the pace and depth of the required reductions in state programs is accelerating, and the need for it is accelerating based both on the science and those targets that are encoded in state law and regulations. Efficiency is the leading tool for state action, and certainly the most immediate tool for state action. And the urgency of all of this warrants rapidly thinking about how do we change our focus on efficiency investments. And I recognize, having sat in the seat that the president is sitting in, and others that that's not really an easy ask. Commission decisions are evidence-based, tied to long-standing, century-long economic principles and legal and regulatory precedent. Things just don't change quickly, and that's a good thing, and it's appropriate. But thinking about how to actually have this transition happen a little bit faster would be better in the current context of state climate policy and what's going on with the climate itself. So viewing it from that perspective should begin to look like the primary goal, or at least on a par with utility and consumer value, and time is of the essence. So I'll stop talking. I look forward to the comments and discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. You really gave us many things to think about through your presentation, and it certainly was in depth. And I just want to remind our audience that at the end of the presentations, there will be a Q&A, and that they can use the Q&A feature or use the raise hand button when they want. So write down your questions so you don't forget. And that's what I was doing. And it, because I have a good memory, it's just a little short. We're going to move now to Mary. And Mary, you're center stage right now.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. It's really great to be here. I have to tell you, you know, your opening comments remind me that the reason I have this lovely ambient light right now is actually haze caused by the fires in California, and I work out of my home in Vermont. So it's wild to think about. It's really wonderful to be here. And before I share my perspective on the report itself, I think it's useful if I tell you a little bit more about O-Power, which is part of Oracle Utilities, and that'll give you a better sense of why we think this research is so important. We're not really like other software companies. Our goal is to drive measurable energy savings through human behavior. And to give you an idea of how we drive those kinds of savings, I want to use a real example for you to try to bring this to life. At ComEd, in Illinois utility, approximately 1.7 million customers receive an O-Power home energy report each year. That's the tool that Paul mentioned was analyzed in the research. And a home energy report is just one example of several behavioral tools. But this one in particular drives 275 gigawatt hours of savings annually. And we know that those savings are there because we use a design methodology that's called a randomized control trial. So unlike something like an installed measure, you know, putting in a light bulb or a structural improvement, behavior change doesn't have an estimated value associated with it. We use treatment and control groups to directly measure the impact of behavior messaging and nudges. So you've got two groups of households. They're similar size, type, demographics. One group receives the targeted education and messaging and the other does not. And then you can measure the difference in how these households save and actually see what's happening, what is the outcome. And to drive those savings, you heard the president mention some of these before, some of the things we do, but we drive them through something called normative comparison. And to put that more simply, it's really the social desire to fit in. And we encourage the right customers at the right time with the right messages to change their behavior. And these are things that might seem small, shifting your thermostat settings. You mentioned turning off your lights, using sensors and timers, or unplugging devices. But at scale, these have a huge impact. And the more data you have, things like usage data, personas, the more targeted and useful these kinds of nudges can be. So these behaviorally driven savings, while not this one-time investment that lasts 20 years, as Paul mentioned in the structural scenario, they have a real measurable impact on energy use today. And what's so cool about this report is that we learned that these near-term savings at scale actually have a real and very significant impact. And you heard already today from both of you about why it is so important to act quickly. What we learned is, based on this research, the Illinois example, the behavioral program we administer delivers more than 3 times the emissions reductions as the structural program. And that kind of came as a surprise to us. I'm not sure we were expecting to see that outcome. So with all that said, what this tells me, my reaction to this, boiled down, is that, well, many of us are really justifiably focused on building decarbonization, looking at the structure of where we live and work. We can't ignore the human behavior side, the human behavior impact on emissions. Structural investments are investments in home weatherization, heating and cooling, electrification, things like that. Those are key to combating climate change. But this other side of the coin, the human behavior piece, plays a really significant role. So my bottom line is that we have to do both, and we've got to do it all, and we have to act fast. I know that's easier said than done, but that's my perspective, and I appreciate getting to be here to share it.
And right on point. I mean, there's no question. Everything you said, we should be doing, and it really is exciting to see more and more states getting involved in these types of things. And O-Power, and I may be wrong here, so if I am, please correct me. O-Power, I had this young man, I've been on the New Jersey board for 15 years, the last almost 3 years as president. Some years ago, I can't remember how many, this young man made an appointment to come in to see me. And he was representing, or he was the founder of, I can't remember which, of O-Power. And I said, or asked him, what is O-Power all about? Well, we're currently working in California, and we're working on behavioral change, setting up competition. And saying, well, Mary, Paul saved more energy last month than you did. And having that kind of competition to change people's mind. Am I correct in that? Yes, Mary? I am. Okay.
Yes, you are. Yeah, that goes hand in hand with the normative comparison, or that desire to fit in. You're driven by what you see your similar neighbors are able to achieve, and that drives you to do more. And then you can be rewarded, either literally, utilities do have financial rewards for performance of certain programs, but also just socially. You are socially rewarded for that change.
That's right. And money is one of the 2 motivators in life.
It is.
So that brings us to Kristin. And we're waiting for you, Kristin. You have center stage, and we're going to hang on every word you say.
I mean, I like to think that at National Grid, money is not our main motivator in life, I think, But first off, I also want to thank Paul for giving me, I did a lot of work in a prior life. I was in Illinois with the Illinois Consumer Advocate, did a lot of work in PJM. And thank you for giving me uplift as a term that is different and one that I can actually support and relate to. So thank you for that. We are, I think, here in part because we believe that energy efficiency is a least cost resource. We are at the center of the states that I think Paul and Mary talked about with aggressive climate goals. I know New Jersey is one of them, but New York, Massachusetts just sent an executive order to go to net zero, and Rhode Island, 100% renewables. So what we're trying to figure out is, what are the tools in the toolbox for all of our customers to be part of this transition? And, I joked about Uplift, but I think there were 2 things that jumped out at me at reading the report. One is that these are publicly, I say public, but all ratepayers fund these programs, right? Every ratepayer needs something in this energy efficiency portfolio that works for them. Not everyone is going to be able to do a structural improvement. Not everyone is going to be, I was a renter when I lived in Illinois. There's only so much I can do. So to me, and I think to National Grid and to utilities, I'll speak in my experience of working with them, it is important that we have programs that can reach all of our customers where they live with what they can do right now to manage their energy usage for them right now. I also think the uplift and the sort of building capacity for these other efforts that we want to have around decarbonization is really important and often, well, I shouldn't say overlooked, but it's just now becoming a more primary focus. When we talk about with customers, you know, we have goals around electrification of transportation and electrification of other aspects, including heat and others. People are concerned about their energy bills and energy efficiency, and in particular, you know, EE, demand response behavioral programs, are one of the things we point them to in terms of you can make this transition and also make it work for your wallet just as much as it can make it work for you in other areas. And so having a sort of comprehensive suite of programs that gives options to customers about how they can use energy can really help us transition to this next generation where we want you to kind of come with us on a journey where maybe we are going to ask you to electrify your car. We are going to ask you to sort of maybe think about electrifying other things in your house. But we've got proven ways to help you manage the impacts of that on your wallet. And I, you know, just kind of want to end by saying, I do think that the notion of the regulatory framework to measure these benefits, you know, when we started the EE wars, at least from my perspective in Illinois, there was a lot of argument over what gets counted on that benefit side of the ledger. I mean, really heated. And I think we are coming now to realize that the climate is really important to our policymakers. It's really important to our consumers, and it's really important for what we do. So Massachusetts is a little bit, I think, unique, and I'm still learning our national grid states. So don't quote me on this if I'm wrong, if anyone's on the phone, but I actually perversely know Illinois probably better than I do others. But we do have directives in Massachusetts as part of the Global Warming Solutions Act and others to actually look at climate benefits as part of our EE plan. The EE guidance document requires that. And I'd like to see more states do that. I think, Paul, you alluded to it. I think the interest is there. I think it's just, we just need to do a better job of helping all our stakeholders understand how to quantify it, understand the value and the certainty. And I think we will get there. But, you know, I was just really impressed with the report and always happy to plug behavioral, because I do think that it's really important for all our customers to have a means to engage in this conversation.
Thank you. No question, Kristin. Thank you for your comments. And I'd like to, before I open it up to our listeners, to our audience, I have a couple of questions, if I may, that I would like to ask all of you. Kristin, Paul, you mentioned electrification, and this has become a big topic in the world of green energy. Electrify everything. We're in the state of New Jersey. We're actually giving rebates for people who are buying electric cars. We're actually going to be giving rebates for the infrastructure that's necessary so people don't have range anxiety when they have that electric car. So charging stations and things of that sort. But Paul, in particular, you mentioned something or alluded to something that it's going to cost money. It's going to cost money for me to plug my electric car in that outlet or to stop at a charging station, so on. The challenge, I think, and I'd love your input on this, and the input of everyone, please, because you're much more of experts than I am. The challenge is balancing the renewables with the energy demand that's going to be required when we electrify. People think that, I think some folks think, that all we have to do, well, you know, in New Jersey, you have 140,000 solar installations. Okay. That's great. You're doing offshore wind. Great. But we're not ready to transition. And probably most states, if not all states, are not ready to transition. It's coming along. So we need those bridges to get us to our goal of 100% clean energy by 2050. In the meantime, I guess my question is, what do we do? The renewables aren't going to be here quick enough, even though we're working 24/7, like so many states. The renewables, Paul, are not going to be here quick enough for the electrification we're looking for. Any ideas?
Yeah, I'll respond quickly and then let Kristin and Mary jump in. President, we've done 2 studies recently, one for New England, one for New York, and we modeled exactly this. We looked at the state decarbonization goals and basically created a pathway to achieving them over the next couple of decades, primarily on electrification as a way of reducing emissions in the building and transportation sectors, because the power grids in the Northeast are relatively clean. You know, it's gas fired. And so what we ended up sort of mapping out is what type of capacity do you still need on the system to maintain reliability? And in both cases, it's a lot of gas-fired capacity. But what happens over time is as the renewables come on, you just are consuming less and less gas and generating fewer and fewer megawatt hours from the capacity that's there and needed to maintain reliability. So you're actually squeezing sufficient greenhouse gas emission reductions out of the other sectors of the economy, while what's happening on the electric system is just flat, maybe only declining slightly. But that gets you on a pathway to get out to 2040 and 2050 and achieve the state standards. The big challenge is you have to keep that gas-fired capacity operating in order to do that reliably. Now, this is where efficiency comes in, because you really change that result in terms of the amount of gas-fired capacity you need to keep operating by much more aggressively implementing energy efficiency, or more aggressively turning people to electrification. And again, where these home energy reports could play a huge role, in addition to investments by utilities in electric vehicle charging infrastructure, whether it's in people's homes or on the side of the road. So I think there is a pathway. It's not easy, but you know what kind of leaps out, as I was saying earlier in my presentation, is in any one of these scenarios, the world only looks better if you're doubling and tripling and quadrupling energy efficiency and demand response as part of that pathway.
Yep, no question about it. Thank you. Kristin, do you have anything you want to add?
I think I would echo that. You know, we've looked at this, and you know, there are a couple things that, you know, we find ourselves, of course, pondering the best way to affordably meet the state goals that we have, and you know, the goals we have as a company about decarbonization. And you know, no one size will fit all across the country. We're not California. We can't do what California does. You know, we have 3 times the heating degree days in January that San Francisco does. So you know, we have different expectations, and I think, you know, as Paul alluded to, the resource mix is different everywhere. But we do want to get there, and that's why I think we would say, you know, to get us to that sort of net zero journey at the end that I think our states, you know, again, Massachusetts is looking for, you need a multitude of pathways, and energy efficiency remains sort of the not just even the on-ramp, but like the high occupancy vehicle ramp of how to do this, right? I mean, it's, you know, it's kind of creates that capacity for renewable integration that I think can be challenging otherwise. Offshore wind, you know, we're very supportive of, you know, we've signed contracts for, but you have to move the wind, you've got to move and create space in the system to kind of manage those impacts, and EE is a good way to do that.
Good, thank you. Mary, did you want to add anything?
No, I think they covered it. That was great. Yeah.
Okay, good. I think so too. And thank you very much. You know, when you look at the transportation sector, whether we're talking about individual cars or we're talking about a fleet of buses or trucks or whatever, here in the state of New Jersey, and I can only go by what we've experienced here, 46% of our carbon emissions come from transportation. 46%. That's a lot, obviously. And we're in a congested area. Northern New Jersey in particular is basically a suburb of New York City. And before the pandemic, it was the traffic was just as bad in northern New Jersey as it was in Midtown Manhattan. So it's transportation is a key to reducing that carbon. And that's why the push for electric vehicles. I have one more question for all of you. We just initiated here an Office of Clean Energy Equity. Our belief is that all segments of our population, all regions of our population, have to be or have the opportunity to be a part of the green energy revolution, regardless of socioeconomic group. Energy efficiency, to me, seems one of the avenues to approach and to involve the underserved community, to truly provide environmental justice. I'd like your thoughts on that, Kristin.
I agree. I mean, I think when you think about the challenges of decarbonizing, you know, you step back and you look at doing it in the context of a lot of the areas have an affordable housing crisis. A lot of the areas, you know, that we're in have challenges on access to public transportation, access to charging stations, access, you know, the code work, the things that need to be done sometimes for the structural behavioral programs can be challenging. And sometimes, you know, we struggle with in the EE context, how you can cover those costs. You know, sometimes our regulators are not necessarily wanting perhaps to approve investment to bring some of these things up to where we could try to be diplomatic, Paul smiling, trying to bring them up to where things might work, which is a challenge for us. And transportation kind of highlights all of that in a nutshell. And if you think about what it means to create equity, you know, you're creating value, which means you're sort of improving either not just sort of your, you know, your economic terms of the value of your property, but your household energy burn, right? I mean, one of the things that we're looking at, like a lot of places, is kind of what does that mean all in? And the electrification of transportation is going to be one where we need to make aggressive steps to perhaps make sure the market is meeting the needs of individuals who don't have access to garages, don't have access to parking, don't have landlords that are going to let them park, or in buildings that, you know, I mentioned affordable housing for a reason, or sort of in buildings that aren't able to handle wiring to upgrade to have charging installed. And yet these are often communities that are most exposed to sort of surface level pollutants from fleets, buses, and, you know, sort of areas that have that in place. You know, I guess I would just say that, like, it is energy efficiency and programs designed to help address those immediate things, that short term. This is where the short term value, I think the report highlights, really resonates with me, because, you know, those are immediate sort of benefits that we can bring. If we can improve and encourage electric vehicles and charging and, you know, buses and places like that, those are immediate health benefits to those communities right there, because that is avoided pollutants, that improves asthma, that improves lung factors overall. That is really, really important. I also think, and we're probably, I don't know where we are in time, but I think it's important because it's also an emerging place for the workforce in the transition, right? We talk about creating a path forward, particularly in the COVID economy. I think for a lot of us at utilities, it highlighted what it's like when our home energy audits stop, what it's like when that work stops, when you can't go out and do that. I think energy efficiency programs writ large, but you know, are going to be part of that future of the clean energy transition, and behavioral programs can keep running. You know, you don't necessarily need to have somebody there to do that. You can lay the groundwork for when we are able to go back in the field and advance our goals as we would. And the electrification of transportation is just part of that broader question about how do we build jobs doing that. We have a moment here to take our breath and to think about the next step, because we haven't been able to go out in the field. So why don't we use it to talk about how we can improve that next generation of workforce and think about moving them over and what, you know, holistically that we can do. So, I mean, I think I don't ever want to say that there's, you know, that Ron Emanuel, who's the mayor of Chicago, was famous, I think, for saying, you know, there's always an opportunity in a crisis, and I don't want to downplay at all the struggles that our customers and communities are having dealing with COVID. But for us, there is an opportunity, I think, to think about what to do when what comes next, now that we've had a chance to step back and reassess.
Good points. Thank you. Mary?
Yeah, I'd love to add to that. I think that's such a great question, especially now, as Kristin points out. And something that we found, which I find just wonderfully reassuring, is through engagement with customers, which, by the way, one of our design principles is that you have to assume nobody's caring or paying attention. And I know we all do. We all care about energy, but most people are not thinking about ways to modify or be empowered with their energy choices. And what we found is that you can bring and change, bills, like these are real things, people's bills, at no or low cost to households. And they all save. Our data show that you can be a low or moderate income household, you can be a wealthy home, you can be a small or large home, and everybody saves at similar rates. So that's just it's just a wonderful reminder that it's one of those key tools that can be brought to everybody, can be brought during a pandemic, and then hopefully can lead to all of these other things as well. It's all part of a journey of getting people to care, along that path to hopefully, the vehicle electrification or the home electrification piece. But this piece, it works and it works for everybody. So there's a value there in equity.
Paul, do you, excellent. You're absolutely right. Paul, did you want to weigh in on this?
No, those answers were great. I mean, it was a bit of a setup question because equity is in the DNA of behavioral efficiency programs, and between what Kristin and Mary say, I feel like we've solved all the world's problems. So I'll stop there.
I think we have to, and it should be on the above the fold in the New York Times tomorrow that we did solve all the problems. And it was a setup question, I think, on my part, because I've been in your position, and sometimes it's nice to get a question where you can really let your views and your passions come out. Dominic, I think we're out of time. Do we have time for at least one question from the audience?
Hi, yes, this is Ashton here. We do have one question that I can read out from Eric Van.
I'm sorry.
Eric Van Orden from Copper Labs asked, do you see environmental and economic value in behavioral demand response as well as efficiency?
Is that directed to anyone specifically?
No one particular. Anyone can take that.
Okay, anybody?
I'd love to jump on that one.
Jump on it.
That's a really great question, and then I didn't get into it because I wanted to focus on this core piece in the research, but that is huge, and I don't want to give it short shrift, and if you want to talk more later, I'd love to. But when you talk about marginal emissions, so what we talked about today is about the value of emissions over years. So getting more emissions out of the system this year is more valuable than in 10 years. But this question about DR, about intra-day and even, maybe someday seconds, is really valuable because of marginal emissions. You tend to emit more emissions during the day at peak times, and we do use behavior regularly through behavioral demand response to use these same design principles to encourage people to shift their usage away from those times of peak, which have real environmental benefits for intraday emissions. It's the quickest way I can answer that.
Good, thank you. Thank you. Paul, do you want to weigh in?
No, I would just add that the in the studies that we've done about these decarbonization pathways, the first thing that happens in the various regions is, in order to achieve progress, there has to be a lot of electrification of the transportation sector. And the first thing it does in the electric sector is it shifts the peak to early evening hours in a really significant way. And so this is the role that both Kristin and Mary have talked about, where these behavioral programs can be used as a tool to push people off of that, or to make them aware that the price for charging your vehicle is a lot cheaper 4 hours later, and you can easily access the following technology so that you can do that. You come home, you plug in your car, but you tell it to charge 4 or 5 hours later. And so we've actually modeled this impact into some of the analysis we've done. It makes a huge difference, and it requires very little information, but everyone having access to that information.
Yeah. Good,
And you can use behavior science to drive that. Yeah, to
that's
drive
right.
change. Yeah.
Kristin, did you want to add anything?
I'll simply, I guess, make a plug for the value of data in doing that. I mean, to do that effectively requires, you know, sort of the metering and the infrastructure to make that happen. I've seen it happen, and you know, and you know, we're looking forward to making it happen here in Massachusetts and in New York and Rhode Island. But the data is really essential to delivering that real-time feedback to customers and fine-tuning sort of the demand for them in a way that can help the grid and help the customer.
Great, thank you. I want to thank all of you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And I want to thank NARUC for giving us this platform to get any of these views across. And I hope that all of the folks who are part of this and have dialed in got something out of it today. I don't know that you're going to get a better panel than the one we have. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to everyone. And I ask that you stay safe, that you take care of yourself, and that you take care of one another. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.